Okay.
Okay, so thank you so much for joining us. We're so honored to have you.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me to talk with you. It's a treat for me. Um, I'm a composer and a pianist. My first training was as a pianist, although I always wrote music. And I have taught all ages and levels and private lessons and classes and coached chamber music. And I really love it all. I love teaching all the different stages of music education from, professionals to 6 and 7 year olds just starting out. I live in Washington, D.C., where I was born, actually. I lived in Boston and New York and New Jersey for a while and then came back here.
Well, thank you so much for your introduction. I think the people watching would will really appreciate it. Can you tell me a little bit about your musical background and how you started composing?
Sure. I always wrote music. When I was a little kid, I would line my sister or the kids on the block up on the piano bench and we'd all improvise stuff. And I never told my piano teachers I was writing music. My parents weren't interested or aware of it. And I think this was both the times, it was the time, but and it was also gendered. I think I grew up in the 1960s and 70s, and new music was really ugly most of the time. Not always, but sometimes lively, but generally ugly. And I think the people around me didn't like it that much. They kind of roll their eyes about the new music. And also, we didn't know about women composers. So I still wrote, even though there weren't any role models that I knew. Um, I thought Frances Scott Key was a woman because it was Frances, and I thought she wrote the Star Spangled Banner music. So that was my one woman composer who's a man who just wrote the lyrics. So I had that all wrong. And I had a very, I'd say, traditional piano training. Lots of technique and competitions and big pieces and drama. And I went to Interlaken one summer, an Eastern Music Festival. And um, when I was in college, I went to Aspen, so these kind of traditional, wonderful places to be as a pianist. Um, and I went to Harvard undergrad. At that time, the music department was very dry and just looking, putting Roman numerals in scores and stuff. So, and I was curious, like, why does music work? How does it work? And there was someone at MIT looking at that named Jean Bamberger, and we could take classes there. And I had a good friend who was a painter who wanted to design her own major. So the two of us designed our own majors outside the art and the music departments. And I took piano lessons with Patricia Zander, who at the time was Yo-Yo Ma's accompanist, which we called it then. And we've come to talk about collaborative piano now. In those days, the string player's name was in big letters and the pianist's name was the accompanist. But so I'd run into Yo-Yo Ma at her house, which was fun. Um, and then I went to Juilliard for 2 years after that as a pianist. I was always still writing music. I did some composition things at Harvard. Um, and then in my early 30s, I did a doctorate in composition. And that was when I finally started calling myself a composer.
Hmm. That's such an interesting journey that you've had so many, I think you've really paved the way for female composers over time because obviously things have gotten a lot better these days and there's composers like you and Jessie Montgomery and all of these like wonderful composers that inspire and allow young girls to delve into the area of composing, right? I think that's super interesting, and I think that also kind of answers the question of who your musical influences were, as you talked about, Francis Scott Key and
Not. Yeah. I think, Patricia Xander was a big influence. She's very poetic.
yeah,
She liked to, if you're playing some 19th century. She'd tell you to go read Keats's letters, and she had books of Chinese art on her coffee table, and she was always making metaphors to visual art and literature and poetry. And she was a big influence for me.
That's really interesting. And so you drew inspiration from her way of life and her outlook on life, right?
Yes, yeah, I thought she was a very wise person, actually. Yeah. I
Mm,
remember her saying things to me like, after I'd played a concert, she's like, look, if you play 60 concerts a year, three will be great, three will be terrible, and all the rest will be in the middle. And you have to be willing to live with that. And, she just had
absolutely.
this kind of life wisdom that I appreciated about music, or, you walk out on stage and you see what you're dealing with that day, rather than trying to, I pictured this other, more of the people in the Schnabel tradition. He was my teacher's teacher, of the generation, not Patricia. She came a different path, but I pictured those people as like building this house of cards backstage and walking on stage and hoping it worked perfectly. And Patricia was much more like, we're improvising, every time you play the piece, you're making it fresh. And she had real wisdom, I thought. So she was
That
a good.
that's amazing that she had that, you know, that modern outlook even in the 60s and 70s, and when the outlook was so rigid on like what a performer consisted of.
Yes. And I was studying with her more in the 80s, but well, no, late 70s, early 80s. Yes, exactly. And it was a much more rigid time about what performers looked like, who composers were. Um, yeah, I was thinking about that from your questions about. I think when I was young, there was also kind of one path. You really hoped you got a New York agent, and it was all one way forward, right? One set of competition. It felt like there was one group who decided who could move forward and who couldn't. I do feel like that's broader now.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, I feel like, I mean, even as a aspiring violinist, I don't I don't look just at becoming a concert violinist, even with me doing this project, I'm looking at so many different ways that I can contribute as a musician. And I think that's changed so much from, just 30, 40 years ago.
A lot. Yes.
So I want to ask you now, so because obviously there's going to be some people watching this that are going to be interested in delving into composition. Do you have any, you know, specific techniques or musical elements that you find frequently incorporating into your works or being inspired by? What's the first thing that a aspiring composer should look at as they start composing?
Good question. And I think I find the composers I meet were also different from each other.
Okay.
So I can say this, but it might, what I do or what I would recommend with my students, but um, people take such different paths, I think, and that all can work. I have several students right now who are really good improvisers in a kind of classical style. I'm trying to figure out like how I was never taught this way. I'm trying to figure out how do you make them better artists. And so I'm trying to talk about I've been trying to make lists with them. So one thing is, are the emotions or feelings interesting? Juxtapositions of things, like putting things next to each other, can that be more interesting? We talk about trying to make more compelling gestures, which is, rhythm and melody combined. Or surprises, so unusual transitions. Like people have said to me things like, take your ideas farther. And that's so vague. It's useful, but it's vague. And I'm trying to figure out how can I help my students ask themselves a little bit more specific questions about how to make their work go deeper or more interesting or to say more. Um, I'd say for, the main thing for students is just to listen a whole lot and experiment, but also not to not to rule out or to stop listening to things that aren't perfect in every way.
Right.
I used to, in the 80s when the music was still pretty crummy, in concerts, new music. I used to go to new music concerts. I remember bringing friends, and then after a while, my friends didn't want to come with me. who weren't composers.
Oh,
But I would go and I always liked something about each piece. And I think I learned a lot from that. Like if you don't just say, oh, the beginning's ugly, I'm not going to listen, or the sounds are ugly, but to stick with it and see how it unfolds, or not to dismiss things too quickly, I think is really important.
absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the biggest learning experiences for me also was when I began working with you, and first of all, working on the Wisdom of Bella Pavis for Johansson, was I think I realized that I also had this like um preconceived notion that, contemporary music could somehow be like very a little too experimental, like uncomfortable. But then as I started working on it, I realized that that's just a stigma that a lot of like classical musicians have, and that we don't open our eyes to the emotions and, experimental things that new music can offer.
I think in my student years, so I experienced what you're saying so intensely because the intelligent composers either wrote 12 tone music or they did experimental like John Cage, which you probably know this, but we used to call it uptown and downtown music, which was about Manhattan, right? What they were doing at Columbia University versus in the village, which
Oh,
was the experimental. And at Columbia was 12 tone. And oddly, a lot of it sounded kind of similar, whether you were carefully constructing things from mathematical numbers or whether you were rolling dice. The harmonies were kind of gray, and the feelings I think were kind of grouchy and gray, but not always. But I think there was in the mid 20th century really a react. People were afraid to talk about emotion in music, in composition. I think my good piano teachers talked about what we were expressing and the chamber music coaches. I played with a lot of good string players and some wind players. And so I went to their lessons. So as a student, I had lessons with a number of the best teachers of that time period and in string and wind playing as well, but more with some of the string players. So I learned some of that. I remember one of the teachers talking about bogan expression, like use the bow to make
oh,
shapes, right? Use the bow to make shapes. And that actually
I did
influenced me
that a lot too. Yeah.
right, as a pianist. But I think other than that, people, music critics and composers did not talk about feelings in music, did not, and modernism didn't like narrative. So people were like anti-story. And I think music, if it takes place in time, it's always some kind of story
Yeah.
and some kind of a voice. It always has a voice, like a personality or a voice or many voices. So like, how can we avoid these things? But I think people were like sort of embarrassed by emotion mid 20th century, which came from a lot of reasons. I mean, it came from reaction to romanticism. It came from the world wars, maybe, or Russian Revolution and so on. Like people just were kind of rigid and scared of too much emotion. And then I think that musicians didn't get very good at talking about emotion, or composers didn't. So, we just say, it's a really great piece, or, put some expression and excitement in it. It's like, let's talk about what it's about. So I think that could really make a difference, I think.
Absolutely. And musicians, I feel like we're like storytellers, so we're always telling a story. That's our entire point. And yeah, like even when I was working on the Wisdom of Bella Pavis, that had such a clear story, which was about your great grandmother, I think. Yeah, I
Great, great, I think.
great
Yeah.
grandmother, yes.
Yeah.
And it's not only is it good for the audience to be listening to a story, but it's also so much more informative as a performer, I think, because you know what you're trying to express rather than having this vague idea of what this piece is. And also, I think it's so much better in the sense that, you add to the story, like you have your own interpretation of the story. You put your personal experiences into the story, and combined it makes such more of a whole experience for the listener.
That's a great way to describe sort of the performer and the composer collaboration. One of
Yeah.
the things I loved about the Johansson was hearing everybody play my piece. I sat there. I heard all the semifinalists play my piece. I sat there for a couple of days. Everybody played it differently. Many people played it in ways that were different than how I would have played it, and I loved what they were doing. I mean, it was so such a model for me of, when we try to do what did Beethoven intend? It's like, he might have liked it 5 or 6 different ways, some passage, it's just
I think
so
one of the most like my favorite things about contemporary music is that we get to connect with the composer like in person, which is like just so new when we're like we've been playing Mozart and Beethoven trying to understand what they want us to do for such a long time. But then suddenly you get to actually like talk to the person who wrote it and understand the meaning behind it. And I just wish more people would like understand that perspective. I wanted to ask you a question actually, which is about exposure in terms of contemporary music. So, I realized that one of the reasons that had this like stigma former to my experiences with your piece was because there wasn't like a lot of exposure regarding contemporary music. I didn't know of any contemporary concerts near me. I wasn't in like there weren't, for example, I wouldn't see an advertisement for a contemporary piece, but I would see an advertisement for a pop song.
sure.
So, in terms of that, what do you think about the exposure, um, and how do you think it's influencing the way contemporary music is being perceived?
Question. I think contemporary music could do more and could do better, and the people promoting it could do more, but it's so much better than in 1980. So,
Absolutely.
and I think there are pockets, I mean, New York City is a good one, and where you can go to, concerts where they're all different ages of people and people
Yeah.
who look a lot of different ways, and um, I think it's improving. And I think when I was a student, the composer, okay, so after there was like 12, the uptown and downtown, then there were like a few more. There were like the bang on a can people and, the post minimalist and the minimalist. There were a few more, but people were in these clear camps and they would say they were really open minded, but really they only liked the people in their camp. That seems looser now. It seems like people's works have more blends of those genres and more of those different camps within contemporary classical. Um, but you're talking about exposure, and I think some of that, maybe some of the instrumental training and the studios and the some of the like orchestra programs are commissioning pieces. So
Yes, that's like one of the best parts right now. Yeah.
But maybe there could be more. Like I try to encourage my piano students to write music.
Mhm.
But I would guess that a lot of the studio recitals of teenagers now do not have the students' own compositions on the program or a classical improvisation or something like that's would be really weird probably. And I think if we could make that a little more popular, that might help.
Yeah, I think so too. And you know, do you, in terms of students, you're talking about how you like encourage students to compose their own pieces. Um, in terms of education, you had, I feel like, a very like rigid pianist training, right? A very traditional as well. And I think when you were growing up, you were talking about how um you didn't have many outlets or like resources or like opportunities to fully pursue composition. And I think that's changed. Like there's a lot of good programs, but I think you would know better than me. So can you tell the audience, are there any particular programs or initiatives that you find promising in promoting contemporary classical music?
For students, there's a program I don't know enough about, a summer program called Walden that I
Oh.
would like to know more about. They're doing composing and improvising in New England, and with teens, I would like to know more about that. What else? Um, do you mean about education or just
Yeah, education.
education?
Or like anything in general that just you think is really pushes, this industry forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking, that when as you were talking, I thought of a story of mine, like when I was at Interlochen as a pianist, as a 15 or 16-year-old in the summer.
Mhm.
I took a composition class and we'd sit around on these funny organs of the time. They had, the keyboards weren't as good as they are now. And right, but then one day we were in some little amphitheater and they had like an upright piano and they put a nature picture, some beautiful nature scene on the music rack and said, play this, as if it was the score. Sit down and improvise and play this picture. And I loved it.
That's so
Oh, that
interesting.
was so fun. So I don't know, we could do more of that with students. I mean, that's for young people. How can we, um, encourage young people? I don't know, just if some of the programs for younger people really push the composing and improvising classes and so on, maybe. But I think also, bringing students to concerts. I did when I used to teach music history classes at George Washington University, and I'd bring my students to concerts. I wanted to make a program. I only did it once or twice. I wanted to have students as a group write reviews for the school newspaper. So like they'd have to talk to each other and write the article together. I thought that would be a productive thing. And we went to some new music things. And I bring the students and we go backstage and meet the composers afterwards and the performers. So that was, I think, makes it more real. Um,
Yeah, that's so, I mean, that's just so great because I think, it encourages discussion of these new music, which also spreads it in a way, between the students. I think that's definitely something that other, professors or programs can implement into the way they teach contemporary music. And
Yeah, when I was growing up, I to try to recapture some of that culture for my students, which I think there was this whole culture of my friends and I, we all went to concerts and my teacher was there and the other, people's parents, and we saw each other at concerts. It was like it was fun. We were a community. We hung out at my piano teacher's house and we'd practice there and help each other with our pieces. If she had, someone was working on something we had worked on last month, she'd send us off to her basement to help with the other student. We were a community and keep trying to make that for my students. But I think, for teachers to go to concerts with their students, maybe you're doing that, but I didn't see that much of that when I was a young teacher. So I tried to try to foster that, that it was some bit
yeah,
of community. I feel like now, and for my students too, sometimes people well, the pandemic changed that too, but before the pandemic, I'd have people who'd sign up for piano lessons who were quite good at the piano who were never going to concerts, and there was somehow not enough. Like, I think it's all part of a culture and community.
yeah. Do you think this is like one of the byproducts of the rise of technology? Because people are more online, chronically online now, as they say, instead of, having real connections, they just do it online. Or what do you think about this?
I think that's probably true. And that it's I mean, yeah, I really bug my students to show up for studio class because I say, you're used to hearing edited recordings online. It's like you have to come and hear other people make some mistakes. This is human. And also, just the vividness of live music, right? It's so different. Um, Oh, I know after the quarantine months when my first students came and played live again, I just cried.
Um,
That
me too,
I know live sound is just so three-dimensional, and it's something to even I think with a good sounds, well, with a great sound system, maybe it's three-dimensional, but most of our sound systems and the compressed sound and the MP3s, it's not three-dimensional, right? It's not enough. And I think just to be there with other people um, is different somehow.
human to human connection is different.
Yeah, I think it's important the little conversations before and after, and I don't know. I think a concert is a strange thing, right? It's a private experience you have in a group, being in the audience, but also the live music. There's nothing like it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this might actually be my last question, but talking about technology, I'm really interested in the rise of AI and the metaverse. And I think that's becoming more prominent in this classical music industry now. We have platforms where you watch concerts with, subscriptions, like s- things like that, and from your perspective, you've been in the industry for so long and you're such an expert, you've seen the rise of digital platforms and streaming services, and what do you think, how has the industry changed? How has the contemporary music scene changed because of that? Yeah, I'd like to.
It's pluses and minuses, and you have to know how to work with it. For me, like for example, Zoom, I at the beginning, just before the pandemic, I got a commission to write a piece for a concert band in Lithuania. And I didn't really know how to write for band. I had played flute in band in junior high school, but I understand orchestra. I get there's all these strings high and low and these colors around and so on. I did not get band where you don't have the central core like the strings in an orchestra. Like band is organized differently. And then the pandemic came up and I didn't know how to get some help writing for band. And I asked David Lang, who was a friend of mine when we were students, and he referred me to a student of his, Ryan Lindveit. He said he's the band guru. And I could take Zoom lessons with Ryan, who was in New Haven, and I was in Washington. And this was like a miracle to have his help. So, to be able to take lessons with people in other cities or to get consultations or whatever is a great thing. And to be able to share our music with people. Like I always picture Brahms showing up to meet Robert and Clara Schumann. Like he's a little younger than they were. And I just picture him showing up with some briefcase with all his compositions, and he stayed for a couple weeks. Now you
Wow.
can send someone a link on YouTube if you want to just give them a taste of your music or hear a taste of theirs.
Yeah.
So these are pluses, but I'll tell you a funny, I don't know if it's AI. It is a computer and music thing. I have some friends in college who are friends with a man who won a Nobel Prize in astrophysics.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, his name's Saul Perlmutter. He proved the universe is expanding. And he's also an amateur musician. So when I was out in Berkeley in California, where he teaches, my husband and I walked around the campus with him, and he was really excited to tell me about a computer program that can write music that sounds like Bach. And I said, yeah, but I can find you Bach pieces written by Bach that don't sound like Bach. So, it seemed like just because you can write a program that can generate Bach-like stuff, it's not the same as real Bach, who
Yeah.
uh, who can write stuff that doesn't always sound like himself.
Mhm.
So I think, that gives us some angle on what a computer can do and what it can't do.
Yeah, I think that's super insightful. The rise of technology has had both its cons, pros and its cons, as you said. And
I had an interesting experience teaching a class during the quarantine on Scarlatti. I had all these adult student pianists, and they all played Scarlatti for each other. And as I saw them for their lessons in the days later, a number of them said exactly the same thing. They said, "I don't think the other people liked my playing." I was like,
oh,
"Wait a minute," because they actually told me that, "Oh, I really like some." I think there was something about the Zoom class that people did not feel the response from the audience, or they didn't feel maybe when they have class in person at my house and then they walk down the driveway afterwards, maybe they talk to each other in the street or something that just didn't happen on Zoom. I learned how to work with the Zoom later to have people introduce things and talk after and so on, but I think there is the real live connection is valuable, and live music.
yeah. Okay, I said that was my last question, but I actually have one more, which is,
Okay. Yeah.
how has or not AI, but just technology in general, impacted contemporary music specifically? Like, has there been an the exposure of contemporary music? Because I want to know, my project, focuses, I'm thinking of making like a website where we introduce all the contemporary pieces that I know. Maybe I can include, that's why I'm doing your interviews. I can include interviews with composers, recordings of myself playing contemporary pieces and other people playing contemporary pieces. I think it can be like a real hub for the interaction and the sharing of contemporary music. And I just want to know what your take on technology impacting contemporary music.
I really love watching the videos on YouTube. I mean, I don't know what I would have done as a teen. I probably would never have practiced because it's so fascinating. Like when I first got used to YouTube, I was like, you could see angles of great pianist hands that you couldn't see in a concert. The camera was here. All we knew was that that profile view with the hands, like I just was like, I would have spent so much time just looking at pianists and how are they doing things. But I mean, to hear composers and to see people performing on video online, doesn't have to be YouTube, but other platforms, I think it's terrific. And I've learned so much music that way, and learned about other contemporary composers in different places around the world. And it's so valuable. It's wonderful. And I mean, also, we had your questions had you were asking about mixed media. I think a lot of people know contemporary music from film soundtrack.
Yeah, yeah.
Everybody knows those weird sounds from the scary places in movies, So I think that I think video helps us in a lot of ways. Not totally,
Mhm.
but when I taught music history in college, I taught a class on dangerous music. It was about banned and provocative music. It was a foil for trying to say, how does music have meaning? And we'd start with Rite of Spring. And for some people, and when we watched a Disney audio, when we watched a reconstructed ballet of it, and then we just listen. And for some people, the music was more powerful and scarier when there wasn't any images. And for other people, it was more intense with the images. Like I
Yeah,
would say about 50-50 of the students. Like some people just have a different engagement with the sound when there is visual than when there isn't.
yeah. That's super interesting. And um yeah, I think film music has definitely impacted exposure of contemporary music. Yeah, I was talking with one of my composer friends, and they were talking about how a lot of kids who are interested in composition right now are also interested in being film composers specifically, because I think with film comes also exposure, which is so important. And you know, and when people watch the films, they also become really, really interested in what they're hearing. I think that's really great for the industry. Yeah.
What's interesting about film too is that it's about the feelings in the character. I mean, it's like, kind of like opera. Like the music sometimes tells you what the character's feeling.
Yes, yes, yes.
And and I think that would be good for us for the concert composers to as what we were saying before, to really be able to talk about the feelings and the music and the storylines. And I think
Yes.
if we could have enough cross fertilization, right, between the film composers and the concert composers. I mean, there's some, but yeah.
Like you. Okay, so this was just such an invigorating and um lovely talk. I think I learned so much from you, and I hope we can talk further in the
Me
future.
too.
Yeah.
Me too. It's wonderful to talk with you and hear all the interesting things you're thinking about.
Yeah. I always accredit, this like my new interest and love for contemporary classical music to you, because, you're the first person I really got to work in depth with, and I just really fell in love with, your piece. And so I just want to thank you always for everything that you've done. Yeah.
You're gonna make me cry. Because you're such a fine musician, and that for you to say that really, it's very moving to me. Thank you. Thank
Oh,
you. It's very,
well, thank you so much for talking to me today. And yeah. Um,
thank you for inviting me. I look forward to being in touch and hearing what else you're up to.
okay. Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Bye bye.